The 1960s gave us some of the most beloved music ever recorded, but not all of it made it to the airwaves without a fight. Some songs were pulled from rotation, forced into re-recording, or quietly buried by nervous broadcasters who didn't know what to do with them. Here are 11 censored songs that were too violent for the 60s. Number 11. Stagger Lee by Lloyd Price.
Stagger Lee from 7, Billy swung the boy through it.
Long before the 1960s began, the story of Stagger Lee had already been floating through American folk tradition for decades. It was rooted in a real event, a shooting in a St. Louis saloon on Christmas night, 1895, when a man named Lee Shelton killed William Billy Lyons over a Stetson hat. Lloyd Price recorded his version of the song in New York City in September 1958, and it was released on ABC Paramount Records. That rock and roll arrangement, driven by a wailing saxophone and a relentless horn section, turned a grim murder ballad into one of the most danceable records of its era. It climbed all the way to number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in early 1959 and spent 4 weeks there. The original recording, with its straightforward account of a cold-blooded shooting, was considered too violent for broadcast on a number of radio stations. Dick Clark, who produced and hosted American Bandstand, made it clear he wasn't comfortable with the violent content either. When Lloyd Price appeared on the show, Clark insisted he perform a toned-down version, one where the confrontation between Stagger Lee and Billy was changed from a fatal shooting to a simple argument between two men. Price complied, and that cleaned-up take is what television audiences saw. Two versions of the song effectively circulated at the same time: the unfiltered original and the sanitized one made for mainstream consumption. The original, as music critic Dave Marsh later noted in his book, was the one kept off the air. The censored version was what made it into record stores and onto top 40 playlists. Stagger Lee had been recorded many times before Price's version, by artists like Mississippi John Hurt and Woody Guthrie. But none of those earlier adaptations had reached this kind of mainstream audience. Price's version was the one that forced broadcasters to confront the song's violent core at that scale. It was later ranked number 456 on Rolling Stone's list of the 500 greatest songs of all time. But in 1959, what listeners heard on the radio wasn't quite the whole story.
Stagger Lee from 7, Billy swung the boy through it.
Number 10. Universal Soldier by Buffy Sainte-Marie. Buffy Sainte-Marie wrote Universal Soldier in the basement of a Toronto coffeehouse called the Purple Onion sometime around 1963. She was a Cree-Canadian singer-songwriter who had grown up partly on a Piapo Cree reserve in Saskatchewan, and she had been thinking seriously about war, not as politics, but as a human pattern that kept repeating regardless of country, cause, or century.
And he thinks we'll put an end to war this way.
The song was a direct and unflinching meditation on personal responsibility in warfare. It didn't point fingers at governments or generals. Instead, it placed the weight of war squarely on the individual soldier, the person who, regardless of ideology, shows up and pulls the trigger. That framing was something many radio programmers in Canada and the United States found deeply uncomfortable. Sainte-Marie released Universal Soldier on her debut album, It's My Way, in 1964. Several Canadian and American radio stations refused to play it. The objections weren't just about politics. The song's implication that ordinary people bore personal moral responsibility for the violence of war was seen as a direct affront to soldiers and veterans. In the context of a country still processing Korea and beginning to escalate in Vietnam, that message didn't sit easily with broadcasters. The song gained wider exposure when British singer Donovan recorded a cover version in 1965, which brought it to European audiences. But the resistance at home remained. Some stations that initially blacklisted it eventually relented as the anti-war movement grew through the mid-1960s, though it never received the same unencumbered airplay as more neutral popular music. Sainte-Marie herself was later placed on a secret watch list by the Nixon administration. which pressured record labels and broadcasters not to promote her work. That blacklisting wouldn't become fully public until decades later, but it began in this era, rooted, at least in part, in songs like this one.
He's fighting in the USA.
Number 9, Run for Your Life by the Beatles.
Rather see a dead little girl than to be with.
When Rubber Soul was released in December 1965, it was widely celebrated as a step forward for the Beatles. More layered, more literary, more musically adventurous than what had come before. But buried at the end of that album was a track that John Lennon himself would later call his least favorite Beatles song.
Better watch your head, little girl, or you won't know.
Run for Your Life was written primarily by Lennon, and its opening line was lifted almost directly from a 1955 Elvis Presley recording of Baby Let's Play House, originally written by Arthur Gunter. The song describes a man threatening a woman, making clear, in no uncertain terms, that he would rather see her dead than with someone else. The threatening, possessive tone was unmistakable. During the mid-1960s, most radio stations in the United States and United Kingdom played it without much pushback. The Beatles' commercial power was enormous, and the threatening language was disguised beneath a bright, catchy melody. But the discomfort was there. The song was frequently cited in discussions about violence toward women in popular music, even at the time.
You better run for your life if you can, little girl. Hide your head in the sand.
The most documented case of censorship came later. In December 1992, Ottawa radio station CFRA banned the song outright after a listener complained that its lyrics promoted violence against women. What made that news particularly striking was, as observers noted at the time, that stations were still playing it nearly 3 decades after its release. In a 1970 interview, Lennon addressed the song honestly. He said he had written it quickly and carelessly, borrowing that opening line and not thinking too carefully about the full implications of what he'd put on record. It remained, by his own account, something he regretted.
Rather see a dead little girl than to be with.
Number 8, Eve of Destruction by Barry Maguire.
Tell me over and over and over again.
P.F. Sloan was 19 years old when he wrote Eve of Destruction in a burst of inspiration one evening in 1964, reportedly producing 5 songs that night. He was a session musician and songwriter at Dunhill Records in Los Angeles, and he had been absorbing folk music intensely, studying its directness, its willingness to say things that polished pop music wouldn't touch.
We're on the eve of destruction.
Barry Maguire had recently left the New Christie Minstrels, the folk ensemble he'd been part of since the early 1960s, and had signed with Dunhill as a solo artist. He recorded Eve of Destruction during his very first session for the label, in June 1965. According to Maguire, the whole thing was done in a single take, with him reading Sloan's lyrics off a crumpled piece of paper. The following Monday morning, a phone call from the record company woke him up at 7 a.m. They told him to turn on the radio. His song was already playing. Within weeks, it was number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100. But not everywhere. A significant number of American radio stations refused to play it. The stated objection was that the song was nihilistic, that its bleak view of the world could damage morale, particularly among young people during a period of intense Cold War anxiety and growing U.S. military involvement in Vietnam. Some critics argued it was an aid to the enemy. It was pulled from retail stores and banned from airplay in various markets across the country. The BBC also added it to their banned list. Eve of Destruction was pulled from retail stores and banned from airplay in various markets across the country. Maguire later recalled that after the song's success, radio programmers were quietly told not to play whatever he released next, and they didn't. Eve of Destruction was the last of his records to reach the top 40. Whatever came after was effectively shut out.
We're on the eve of destruction.
Number 7, My Generation by The Who. The Who released My Generation in the United Kingdom in October 1965, and it reached number 2 on the UK singles chart. It was a raw, grinding statement of generational frustration, the kind of song that felt less like a composition and more like something that had been building up pressure for a long time and finally broke through. Roger Daltrey's stutter on the word generation, whether affected or authentic, was the detail that gave the BBC pause. The BBC's concern was that the stuttering might cause offense to people who actually lived with that speech impediment. They kept the song off the air initially on those grounds, which was the stated reason. But the line, "Hope I die before I get old," delivered with genuine contempt, was also noted by broadcasters as problematic, a sentiment that seemed to celebrate a kind of self-destruction. The BBC ban didn't hold. My Generation went on to chart regardless, and the corporation eventually relented. But the initial resistance was real, and it said something about how the establishment was reacting to the sheer aggression of the new music. What young people heard in My Generation as honest self-expression, programmers heard as an invitation to disorder. Pete Townshend wrote the song after reportedly receiving a complaint from the Queen Mother about one of his cars, an old Packard hearse he had been keeping near Buckingham Palace. Whether that story is apocryphal or not, My Generation became one of the defining documents of a generation that had very little patience for the way things had always been done. Number 6. Hey Joe by Jimi Hendrix. The song Hey Joe had been floating around the American folk scene for several years before Jimi Hendrix recorded it. Billy Roberts registered it for copyright in January 1962, though questions about authorship lingered for years. The earliest commercial recording came from a Los Angeles garage band called The Leaves in late 1965, and by 1966 the song had been recorded by Love, the Standells, and several other West Coast acts.
I heard you shot your woman down, you shot her down.
Hendrix recorded his version at Delane Lee Studios in London on October 23, 1966. It was released as the debut single of the Jimi Hendrix Experience on December 16, 1966, in the United Kingdom, and it entered the UK Top 10 in January 1967, peaking at number 6. The song tells the story of a man who has shot his wife and is heading to Mexico to escape justice. There is no ambiguity in the narrative. It is, from start to finish, about a killing. While the song was not universally banned in the 1960s, it faced restrictions and resistance in various contexts due to its violent subject matter. That resistance would become more explicit decades later. Clear Channel Communications added it to their list of banned songs in the aftermath of the September 11, 2001 attacks, a list that included over 160 tracks flagged for violent content. The BBC confrontation came not from the song itself, but from Hendrix's behavior around it. On January 4, 1969, Hendrix appeared on the television program Happening for Lulu. After beginning a performance of Hey Joe, he stopped the band mid-song, dedicated an impromptu version of Cream's Sunshine of Your Love to Eric Clapton, Ginger Baker, and Jack Bruce, and ran well over the show's allotted time. The BBC banned him from appearing on British television as a result. It turned out to be his final appearance on British TV. The song was listed at number 201 on Rolling Stone's 500 Greatest Songs of All Time, and VH1 ranked it the 22nd greatest hard rock song ever recorded.
Hey, Joe, I said.
Number 5. I Feel-Like-I'm-Fixin to Die Rag by Country Joe and the Fish. Country Joe McDonald wrote this song in 1965 while living in Berkeley, California. It was one of the most direct anti-war songs of the decade, a sardonic, almost carnival-like march that used dark humor to describe the machinery of the Vietnam War draft and the senseless death it was producing. The song was first released on an independently distributed EP in 1965, then re-recorded and included on the band's 1967 debut album Electric Music for the Mind and Body, and again on their second album that same year. The BBC restricted it from play in the United Kingdom, and a number of American radio stations refused to broadcast it, citing both its anti-war message and the pointed graphic language it used to describe soldiers being sent to die for reasons they couldn't be told.
5, 6, 7, open up pearly gates. Well, they know.
What made the censorship complicated was that the song's tone was satirical rather than somber. It didn't mourn the dead. It mocked the system that created them. That irreverence, in the eyes of broadcasters, was arguably worse than straightforward protest. It was harder to dismiss as mere sadness. It read more like defiance. The song's most famous performance came at Woodstock in August 1969, where Country Joe led the enormous crowd through its opening call and response chant before launching into the song itself. By that point, it had become something of an unofficial anthem of the anti-war movement. But that status didn't come until after years of being kept at arm's length by mainstream radio.
It's 1, 2, 3. What are we fighting for? Don't ask me, I don't.
Number 4, Ode to Billie Joe by Bobby Gentry.
Billie Joe McAllister jumped off the Tallahatchie Bridge.
In July 1967, Capitol Records released a debut single by an unknown singer-songwriter named Bobby Gentry. Industry insiders assumed it would go nowhere. The song was too long, too slow, too strange, too dark. They were wrong. Ode to Billie Joe shot to number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 within weeks of its release, knocking All You Need Is Love by the Beatles out of the top spot. It stayed there for 4 weeks. Gentry won 3 Grammy Awards the following year, including Best New Artist, the first country artist ever to win in that category. The song is narrated by a young woman whose family casually discusses the suicide of a local boy named Billie Joe McAllister over dinner. He has jumped from the Tallahatchie Bridge. The family passes the biscuits and talks about farm work. Nobody seems particularly disturbed. The narrator says almost nothing.
Hey, Billie Joe McAllister jumped off the Tallahatchie.
The reason some radio programmers were cautious about the song was that its subject matter, suicide, and the community's indifference to it, was considered deeply uncomfortable. Industry wisdom at the time held that songs touching death and self-destruction so directly, without resolution or moral lesson, were risky to broadcast. The question of what had been thrown off the bridge before Billie Joe jumped consumed the public's attention. But Gentry herself always said that question missed the point entirely. In a 1967 interview, she described the song as a study in unconscious cruelty. People sitting at a table, barely acknowledging the death of someone they knew, more interested in what was for dinner. Gentry produced the song herself, though Capitol Records didn't give her credit for it at the time. She would spend years afterward pointing that out in interviews and in the industry press. The song was selected by the Library of Congress for preservation in the National Recording Registry in 2023.
Billie Joe McAllister jumped off the Tallahatchie Bridge.
Number 3, Happiness is a Warm Gun by the Beatles.
I'm going down, down to the bits that I...
The title came from a gun magazine. John Lennon saw it on a cover, a line being used to advertise firearms, and thought it captured something genuinely disturbing about America's relationship with weapons. He wrote the song and included it on the Beatles' 1968 double album, known as the White Album, which was released in November of that year. Shortly after the album came out, Happiness is a Warm Gun was banned by a number of radio stations. The stated objection was not violence, it was drugs. Many broadcasters were convinced that the phrase warm gun was a reference to shooting up heroin, and that the song's fragmented, shifting structure was designed to mimic the experience of a drug rush. Lennon denied this repeatedly, and Paul McCartney backed him up in a 1968 interview, explaining that the phrase came directly from a firearm advertisement, and that he himself had been shocked by how casually guns were being sold to the American public.
Mother Superior jumped the gun.
Number 2, The Unknown Soldier by The Doors. The Doors released The Unknown Soldier as a single in March 1968, at a moment when the Vietnam War had reached a new level of public visibility. The Tet Offensive had begun in January of that year, and footage of combat was appearing nightly on American television screens. The song landed directly into that context. Jim Morrison wrote the track as a reflection on what he saw happening in American living rooms. Families eating dinner, while the news showed bodies. Violence broadcast alongside commercials. A war reduced to background noise. The song recreates that contrast musically. It builds through a military-style drum march, includes the sound of rifle fire simulating an execution, and then breaks into a jubilant finale where Morrison declares the war is over, while church bells ring and crowds cheer. Many radio stations refused to play it. The violent imagery, particularly the simulated execution, was too graphic for comfortable broadcast. As a result, the single only reached number 39 on the radio charts, but the band reported that its sales figures were considerably higher than the chart position suggested, meaning people were buying it even when they couldn't hear it on the radio. Anecdotal reports from the period indicate that "The Unknown Soldier" circulated widely among American soldiers serving in Vietnam, who appreciated what it was saying about the way the war was being consumed at home. The song remains one of the most vivid documents of how 1968 sounded, from the inside of a country that didn't quite know what to do with what it was seeing. Number 1. Street Fighting Man by the Rolling Stones. The Rolling Stones had been banned from radio for various reasons throughout the 1960s, largely for the sexual content threaded through their catalog. But Street Fighting Man, released in August 1968, was different. It wasn't about sex, it was about the streets. Mick Jagger wrote the song after witnessing the anti-war protests and demonstrations that swept through London in March 1968, when tens of thousands of people marched to the American Embassy in Grosvenor Square. The energy in the streets that spring was unlike anything he had seen before, not just in London, but across Europe and the United States. The song tried to capture the tension of that moment, the feeling of being in the middle of something enormous, and not knowing whether it would lead anywhere or just exhaust itself. The release could not have been timed more badly, or perhaps more perfectly, depending on how you look at it. Street Fighting Man was released in the United States just days after the violent clashes between protesters and police at the 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago. Radio stations in Chicago, still raw from the events outside the convention center, refused to play it. Other stations followed. The song's chart performance in the United States was modest. It peaked at number 48 on the Billboard Hot 100. In the United Kingdom, the situation was different. Decca Records, the Stones' British label, refused to release the song there at all, fearing it would inflame the political situation. It wasn't available as a UK single until many years later. Today, Street Fighting Man is a standard part of the Stones' live catalog and is considered one of their most important recordings. In 1968, it was a song that major labels and radio programmers didn't know how to touch. These 11 songs tell you something about what the 1960s were actually like. Not the curated, softened version that gets remembered, but the rawer one. A decade where artists were pushing into territory that made broadcasters, labels, and government officials genuinely nervous. Some of those songs were kept off the air. Some were forced into sanitized re-recordings. Some found their audiences anyway, through word of mouth or underground circulation, and eventually became the very songs that define the era. The bands didn't last, but they happened. And knowing they happened makes the music feel a little more alive, a little more like something that once cost someone something to put out into the world. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe for more music history. We'll see you in the next one.